want to drill down now into really what the on-demand economy looks like today as really an overture for a lot of the themes we're going to be going over throughout the day in different panels and keynotes. So our definition, this comes from our white paper that we published on the local on-demand economy. At its very basic level, our definition is that load apps summon products or services on demand to be fulfilled or delivered offline, locally. It's a very local story. So for users, that brings immediate needs to their fingertips. That very much resonates in an increasingly on-demand culture, as we're going to go over. For providers, load really aggregates demand for them, creates more transparent marketplaces, and reduces their customer acquisition costs. So when you bring that all together, it brings buyer and seller together more efficiently with leaner unit economics, as I'll give a few examples of it in a minute. So first of all, what's really driving this? So first of all, it's mobility. Smartphone penetration and smartphone culture has really engendered a society that very much is conditioned to expect things on demand. I like to say that the mobile device is the remote control for the physical world. You also have accelerating that millennials. It's a generation for which the term on demand could be even a tagline. I hope I'm not insulting anyone by saying that. And I think that that's really given the on-demand economy really kind of fertile ground to grow. It's really receptive to a lot of these different demographics, but also geographic. Urbanization. We have more people living in cities than ever before. So that creates a population density that very much allows marketplaces to grow easier. So there's also a lot about urban lifestyle that's conducive to on-demand services, not owning a car, not owning a washer dryer or a tool shed, and all these things that create gaps for on-demand services to fulfill. So for all these reasons and many more that we break down in our white paper, I won't go through all of them, it's really kind of creating fertile ground for this movement. So really it's also about supply and demand imbalance and really growing those two sides in sync. So everything I just went over is really on the demand side. And demand is going to be pervasive. I think it continues to be pervasive based on all those very deeply culturally rooted trends. So really the magic is in the supply. And what we're starting to see is companies that are being successful with load have a common element, which is they're able to aggregate previously disaggregated kind of sources of supply. And that's people's knowledge or their time. And it's Uber kind of marshaling all of these drivers and then also creating the matching algorithms and the logistical systems to then deploy that supply when demand happens in a very kind of lean way. So it's really kind of finding that liquidity in supply. And really what's enabling that, again, is mobility. And the data that mobile is able to provide in terms of where people are, who's available, and to kind of deploy them locally in these logistical systems. What I like to go back to is a quote from Brendan Benzing. And Brendan, I think you're here. I think I saw you walk in. He doesn't know that I was going to quote him. But actually, this was from our conference we did in December. And you said something that really kind of stuck with me, which is that what we're talking about really here in this kind of formula of supply-side optimization is yield optimization. Uber in the early days had a brick business, which was town cars, but it was all the time in between those rides that was the mortar, and that's the value that technology is really extracting due to mobility. So this is really kind of at its base level the formula we're seeing as a common element in a lot of on-demand marketplaces that are succeeding. So another attribute that I really want to spend some time on is the favorable unit economics that I alluded to earlier. So because buyer and seller are linked more directly and more efficiently, it tends to sidestep a lot of the parts of the supply chain that have traditionally caused margin compression. So having a building or a fleet of cars or a storefront or a big marketing budget. The economics are a lot leaner. And the best way to describe that is with a few examples. So one of them is Grubhub. Not a company usually thought of as being one of the newer batch of companies in the on-demand economy, although you could argue that they're one of the originals in being in food order and delivery. But what they're doing recently is very interesting and I think very telling. So they're starting to work with restaurants that are non-sit-down restaurants. And they're doing this a lot in New York. So that's the case with a lot of catering companies and a lot of kind of chefs that are popping up. And the advantage that these companies have is that they don't have a restaurant. They don't have the bottlenecks of how many people they can seat per day. They don't have a wait staff. They don't have the polish and all of the operations and the reservation systems that are required in a traditional restaurant. So that significantly lowers their overhead. So Grubhub is working with them to basically aggregate demand for them and find them customers through a delivery system. Now, the economics are so favorable because all of those overhead costs go away that the customer gets a very affordable meal. The chef or the kitchen that we're talking about here still gets pretty healthy margins because a lot of their costs have gone away, and then Grubhub still takes a cut. So I think that kind of three-sided marketplace and how the economics are being reallocated is very telling of a lot of the models that are thriving. Another example is an example I love. It's not a big dollar category, but I think it has some of the elements that really tell this story, which is car washes. There's a company called Wipe. Like restaurants, one of the biggest cost structures of a car wash is real estate and having, being on a busy intersection, being able to have people come in. So what Wipe does is it deploys car wash professionals on demand to basically use your driveway and your hose and your water supply and all these things that, again, cut out a lot of that traditional overhead so that the economics are more favorable. The customer gets a cheap car wash. That car wash professional still gets healthy margin. And then there's still some margin for Wipe to take as a cut. And the other thing that's interesting here is the way that these companies are they're deploying that supply, in addition to having favorable unit economics in terms of the supply chain and overhead and everything I just went over, it's also interesting to note how they're deploying and connecting supply and demand in very efficient ways that is almost analogous in a retail sense to the just-in-time inventory system that was popularized in the 80s by Harley Davidson and others, where inventory, instead of sitting on a shelf and taking up eating up cash flows, is deployed right when it is needed. So these companies are also working with that principle of kind of just-in-time service is kind of the mashup that I would peg it with. Now, another quick example before I move on is Avo. Now, Avo is a company that has been around for a while, and they're working with lawyers. They're essentially a network and a directory of lawyers. Now, they decided to bring an on-demand kind of function into what they were already doing. Because lawyers, what they do, as we all know, is they schedule their time and appointments in hour chunks throughout their day. And that leaves a lot of gaps in between of timelines that are an hour or less. And it's hard for them to liquidate that time and monetize it. And it's really not worth their while to do so because of all of the processes around acquiring customers and scheduling and all these other things. So Avo came along and said, okay, let us do that for you. We'll handle the customer acquisition, we'll handle the scheduling and the payments. All you got to do is pick up the phone and answer the phone and give some legal advice. So what that has come down to is that because Avo's taking care of all that stuff, lawyers will charge less than their normal billable rates. So the economic model they've come up with is $39 for 15 minutes with a lawyer. And that allows them to liquidate those smaller chunks throughout their day. And 15 minutes might not seem like a lot, but I actually tried this just to see if there's really some value there. And it's great if you are at the front end of a legal process. Instead of what might be overkill and meeting with a bunch of lawyers, you can kind of get your ducks in a row, level set, find out what kind of legal artillery you'll need in 15 minutes. And it's a good way to kind of atomize what was otherwise this kind of big, kind of heavy process. Lawyers also love it because it's a lead gen medium for them to kind of bring in people through these consults. So those are a few examples of just kind of the economics, how they're playing out. So that's interesting too. The other reason I bring up Avo is to say that this on-demand model is going into almost every local vertical that we can imagine. We've seen some pretty quirky ones too. We're going to have a fun session later where we're going to kind of guess where this can go next. But I bring up Avo because it's not only moving into different verticals, but it's moving up the ladder to higher end professions. We're talking architecture. Design is a big one I believe it's going to grow into, where graphic design, getting a quick logo made for your company, or interior design. And lawyers, doctors, we're going to hear from Heal later with the kind of medical vertical. So the interesting thing here too is I mentioned millennials earlier as being avid consumers of the on-demand economy. One thing a lot of people aren't talking about is that they're also going to be very pervasive on the supply side. If you look at the kind of characteristics of the generation being very attuned to empowerment and flexibility, that's really what these load kind of gigs, as they're known, are known for. And as it moves up market, it's going to be really appealing for another segment of the millennial generation that have higher levels of education or higher skill sets. And it could really start to be the new way we look at how work is done, as it's not only in drivers and dry cleaning, as I like to say, but a higher swath or a larger swath of the overall working public. So winding down here, because load is bringing buyer and seller together more efficiently, because it's kind of compressing the supply chain, some of those other things I mentioned, it has the potential to displace local marketing as we now know it. And what I mean by that is that local marketing is an upfront budget that is created, an upfront campaign that is created in order to aggregate demand and acquire new customers. Now, load is almost achieving that same end of customer acquisition, but in a different way. So an Uber driver, for example, instead of starting a business of driving and taking out a Yellow Pages ad or a Google search campaign, simply joins a network where they are then deployed to meet the supply in real time. And for that, they pay 20% as they go for the scheduling, the customer acquisition, and the payment processing. Now, for a lot of businesses, that's actually more tenable and more attractive because there's less upfront risk and upfront capital investment to kind of get going quickly. So that's kind of the basic model. And the question is, if that's the case, is that taking money away from local marketing as we know it? And the $140 billion that BI Kelsey now projects makes up local advertising. Now, I think that's a scary concept for a lot of folks that are local media companies that sell local advertising. But I think that the net effect will be more positive because the on-demand economy, though it will siphon dollars away from local marketing to some degree, will also basically increase the size of the addressable market of SMBs to those that don't currently advertise. So a little bit of math there. We have 27 million businesses, small businesses in the US, according to the SBA. About 19% of those advertise according to our data. So that leaves the remaining 81%, which is about 22 million businesses that are the addressable market for the kind of micro entrepreneurs that the load will really tap into. So the question that remains is that can local media companies that currently serve different flavors of marketing and advertising packages either buy or build or acquire and kind of tack on load services as an overall bundle? And I think that the answer is that's a huge opportunity because it aligns with another trend we're seeing at BI Kelsey, which is over the last 3 years or so, we've noticed that local and kind of serving SMBs isn't just about sales and marketing anymore. It's a lot of other operational needs. It's not only helping them get customers, it's helping them keep them. It's payment processing, it's CRM, it's back-end stuff. And the benefit there for local media companies is that those things have a higher switching cost. So the retention is a lot higher. Local advertising, one of the pain points has always been that the churn is so high. So this is really a play towards not only a larger addressable market, but higher ARPA metrics and things like retention. And I think that that's really one of the opportunities that we see in the on-demand economy. Of course, there are so many facets to it, but how it affects and how it impacts the existing local media ecosystem is an important point that we'll talk about a little bit more later. So really the question that all leads up to is if my premise is correct, that it's bigger than the current addressable market of SMBs, the $140 billion in ad spend, if it's bigger than that, how big are we talking? And Mitch alluded to some of these figures earlier and has a lot more and has done a lot to quantify this. So Mitch, I guess I'll pass it back to you at this point. Thank you.